So now I just want to go back to the concept of resources. Now I talked about resources when I talked about the planning process, and I said, identify the goals, identify the activities, identify the tasks, and who's going to do what when. And I said, as you're doing that, also look at unpacking resources. So resources can be things like equipment or tools or technology. It can also be people. When we're thinking about resources, resources can be standard or non-standard. So standard resources are things that you generally already have access to. So you think about copy paper, for example, is a standard resource in most organizations. There's an ordering procedure, and if you need extra, you can put in a requisition for it and so forth. And it's you don't really need senior management approval for that. However, non-standard is stuff that usually isn't available, such as through a requisition. So you might have copy paper as a standard resource, but you might not have some type of copy machine as a standard resource. So if something was to go wrong, or if you need a new printer as part of your goal, that would be a whole separate way to go about that. You probably need to do some type of business case or plan and put forth a business proposal for management to sign off, and it would have to be accounted into the CapEx budget or something like that. That would be an example of non-standard, something that isn't readily available and is a separate process. And that's really important to think about when you're developing your plans, because usually if your plan requires a couple of thousand sheets of paper, you don't need to think too much about that in terms of uh, um, including time for it to get in or for an ordering process. You can pretty much just have that as assume that that stuff would be available. You might have an extra step in there of putting in a requisition for an additional 2 reams of paper. However, if you decide that you need a piece of equipment that's non-standard, that then has a total impact in terms of the you would, as your plan, you'd have to include extra steps of putting forth the proposal, getting it approved, allowing for getting the quotes, allowing for the approval of the quotes, allowing for delivery, and all that's going to have an impact on your final outcome, your goal. So that would then lead on to things on whether you purchase or you hire and so forth. Uh, Resources can also include materials, communication materials, such as we talked about reports or having posters up. You would have to also include those as part of your plan to get those developed. And again, is that internal or are we going to outsource that? Then that has an impact on costs, on resources of finance. And then people, not only do what people do we need, but also what's the skill mix, because we don't generally just hire people, we hire people's capacity and capability. So we're thinking about knowledge, what theory do they need to have, what skills, what experience, and so forth. And we also think about things such as the dynamics of the team, the mix of the team, availability, and so forth, local, remote, whatever the case may be. And of course, with that, it can be permanent, it can be contracted. Again, we can recruit internally or we can outsource that. We can temporary recruit and so forth. And in most organizations, there'll be procurement processes in place. So if that's the case with your organization, making sure that you're, as part of the planning process, that you're familiar with the procurement process so that you work in line with that, so that that doesn't create some type of obstacle or barrier for you as you're going through because you haven't considered some critical step in the procurement process and it's going to push back your time in an extra 3 weeks or something. And procurement, for those who aren't familiar, really refers to the process of purchasing or acquiring resources. And there's usually, in terms of procurement processes, there'll be things around, what we can purchase, what limits. So perhaps under X amount of dollars, we can purchase with just an approval from our manager. Anything over X amount of dollars has to go up through some type of panel review. That could also include things such as what we have to go out for tender for, and how those tenders are evaluated, and what timing is required in terms of awarding or signing contracts. It also gets us to think about things such as quality standards and how we measure those against those contracts and so forth. So there's a bit to consider there. Really, all I want to say here is that as you're doing your plans, just making sure that you're aware of your organization's procurement processes and working in line with those so that you're not creating any obstacles as you go along. Um, and just going to that point of people as well, making sure that you're working within your human resource processes for for the people that you need or the skill mix that you need for your for your for executing your plan. And when I talk about skill mix, it can be about recruiting for particular skills, or it can be about developing skills internally. Sometimes, the people are available, but we don't have the skills, and we have to do some training to bridge or to gain those skills. So part of that, often as part of the planning process, is doing some type of skills analysis or determining what is required, and that's just a matter of identifying as you're going through your breakdown of your planning. So as I talked about, particularly when I was talking about some of those work breakdown structures, project tools for planning, identifying the skills that you need. You list down those skills, and then you can have a look at your existing team or workforce. Are those skills available? So you undertake an audit. Okay, I see Tony. These are the skills I need. Tony would traditionally do this task, or is available to do this task. Does he have the skills required? Undertake an audit, and that might mean asking Tony, hey, Tony, do you know anything about this? Might be looking at my training records or my competency, might be looking at my existing duty statements and seeing if that's something that I've done or so forth. And then identifying as part of that audit, identifying when we review what we've actually found as the audit and match it against the skills required, is there a gap there? And if there's a gap, what do we do with that gap? Do we provide training? Do we have the capacity to provide training? Do we have to go outside the organization to get some training? So bring on an organization like Macmillan to do it? Or do we just outsource that? Is there some type of temporary employment arrangement that we can get someone to come in with those skill sets? So something like a recruitment agency or a temporary agency. Or do we have to just recruit for that and go to market and get someone in who can do that, whether that be for recruit for the timing of our endeavor. So if it's a 6-month plan, that we get them in for the 6 months, or whether we recruit them permanent because there's going to be ongoing work for them. When we do the recruitment process, we should be, first step is of course to identify the role and the skill sets, and that's things like position descriptions or job statements, job profiles, uh, any handover meetings or notes that we've had from people who may have been in similar or prior roles, or just getting that feedback from others through things like toolbox meetings or scrums. Once we've identified that position, then we can advertise for that position, I should say, because identifying the position will give us a criteria by which we're recruiting against. We advertise, we review the applications against the criteria. We shortlist it for those who have met the criteria or those who have risen to the top against the criteria. And it might be because we want to do, say, 10 interviews. Then we do those interviews from those who have been shortlisted. We may do a second interview. So we may then shortlist again, might do 3 second interviews. From there, we then measure both the written response and the interview responses against the criteria of the position. The candidate who has scored highest against that review of their responses against the criteria, the candidate who has reviewed highest and has shown greatest merit for the position, then gets offered the position. Once they accept, we let all the other candidates know that they're unsuccessful. Then we bring them on board. We undertake induction, where we provide an overview of the role, the workplace, introduce them to their colleagues, inform them about things such as working conditions and arrangements, breaks and so forth, and do a range of induction training such as safety and any other compliance training required for the role.